Hi, could I just ask Luke to put his thumbs up? Oh, Luke, I've just said, can I ask him? And he's immediately
Yes, yes,
disappeared. Uh,
yes, I'm here. Yeah,
could you put your thumb up if the screen sharing is going okay?
it's working. It's working. Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Well, today, the talk that I'm offering is on Popper and Critical Rationalism, Lecture 6, The Empirical Basis. By way of an introduction, and this is all a bit speculative, I mentioned earlier that Popper was briefly a Marxist. And while his Open Society was critical of Marxism, Popper also freely admitted that his own treatment of Plato and of Hegel, in some ways, I quote, bears the stamp of Marx's influence. While he makes clear that in his discussion of what he calls the autonomy of sociology from psychology, Popper is, I quote, developing what he believed to be Marx's anti psychologism. The chapter in which this is discussed starts by quoting Marx to the effect that it is not the consciousness of man that determines his existence, rather, it is his social existence that determines his consciousness. And this is from the Theses on Feuerbach. And in my view, someone might suggest that Popper's view of the empirical basis could be read in the same spirit. But I think I mentioned earlier on that Popper was, as a relatively young man, engaged in assisting um, in the translation of Lenin's Materialism and Empirical Criticism, a critique of Ernst Mach. And I think that this sort of uh, anti Machian thrust, and if you like, a sort of materialist thrust, could be said to run through a lot of Popper's work. What is the problem of the empirical basis? Those in the empiricist tradition typically took our knowledge to be based on experience. But if you talk about our knowledge being based on experience or depending on experience, if you don't like talking about a basis, there's an ambiguity about what this might mean. On the one side, one might take experience in this context to be something about our psychological experiences. That's to say, the kind of thing that David Hume was concerned with when, in his treatise, he wrote about impressions. And equally, the sort of thing which in the early 20th century was quite often referred to as sense data. Alternatively, and this is the view that Popper takes, one might take experience in this context to be statements about what in the world is being experienced by us. Let us look at the pros and cons of some different approaches here. First of all, statements about our experience. This might seem an obvious way to go. Indeed, on two counts. First, it might be claimed to be what our evidence for or against some hypothesis is all about. And second, it appears, if this is something that one is attracted to be something that we can know for sure. Let me consider these claims in reverse order. Certainty. There is a sense in which the thing about which I can be most sure is what I am experiencing. I might start here, say, by making claims about the table that is in front of me. But the table, clearly, if I report in those terms, has features which go beyond what I can see or what I can feel if I touch it. That's to say, I take it, if I'm looking at a table, to be an ordinary structure rather than, as it were, a concatenation of objects which would give me the same visual impression. Richard Gregory's book, Iron Brain, now a few years old, offers quite an interesting discussion of some of this stuff. In addition, I impute to the table, if I claim that I'm seeing a table, various properties, solidity, persistence through time, and so on, which go beyond what in any sense I can see directly. One way to go in this context would then be to make restricted statements about the thing that I'm observing. For example, H. Price, in his book Perception, advocated such an approach. He, in this book, starts by talking about a tomato, by making statements about a tomato he's looking at, and then shifts, taking out some of the content of this to talking instead about a red, bulgy surface. The difficulty here is, if you want to follow Price's approach, what restrictions should I make and on what basis? That's to say, if I'm just left to myself, it's not clear that I can tell what might be problematic. If I want to claim only a little, it's not clear how little I should claim. While the less I claim, the less content the claim that I'm making has. And here we have a picture on my left, at least, of H. Price, and on my right of a tomato. There's also the problem that while making a claim about a red bulgy surface is asserting less than does the claim about a tomato, it's not clear that I can be certain about it. For example, I might have just been reading Descartes' First Meditation and get worried about whether I might be being deceived by an evil genius who causes me to see a tomato, or indeed a red bulgy surface, when in fact there isn't any such thing about. Or, more prosaically, I may know that people do sometimes make mistakes even about the most obvious of things. I have, for example, a vivid memory from when I was young of having stood in a school playground in the fall, in the autumn, and having seen the moon spin completely round on a clear night. So that if someone came to me and said, "Have you seen the other side of the moon?" I would say, well, I certainly have a strong recollection of that. The moon, and I tracked the markings around, turned completely round in a circle. I have a strong memory of this. Another tack here would be to shift to making claims about what I was experiencing. That's to say, to making claims about my experience as such. Here, I would seem to be getting to what was certain, or at least as close to it as seems feasible. And indeed, if someone wanted to explore this, there are two different paths here which they might take. I might make claims about so-called sense data. The problem here is that sense data seem to be somewhat awkward constructions. That's to say, it looks to me as if we in fact experience things in a realistic mode. It seems, as it were, as if we see things directly. And the move back from that, from tables and tomatoes and so on, to sense data of a particular kind would seem to involve an act of construction or abstraction. There is further the problem that we don't readily have available to us a language in which to describe most of our sensations other than in terms of what it would be like to experience objects. If we could overcome this and find some way just of talking about what is given to us by our senses, there'd also be a problem about how we relate this information to our theories, to which I'll return. In the face of all this, one way to go would be to talk in terms of, it appears to me as if I'm seeing a desk or something along those lines. Or perhaps, as I think A.J. Ayer put it at one point when exploring these ideas, I am seeing a seeming desk. Well, there still may be epistemological problems about this. I mean, I might have made a slip of the tongue or be confused about terminology. An expert about furniture may say that I've actually got it wrong, that it isn't a desk, it is something else, and gives me a bit of kind of antique dealer's terminology, which I'm not actually familiar with. In this context, it seems to me that it's worth bearing in mind a very interesting point made by the philosopher Hilary Putnam. He was a New Yorker and very much a city dweller. And he said, look, I know only a little bit about trees. So I could probably recognize, one or two trees as being particular ones, the rest just are trees, but there's a division of labor concerning our language. That he made clear in this context that if he makes some statement about trees and it's wrong, he would expect to be corrected. And I think the point that he's making is an extremely important one about language, that we often talk about languages being shared, but many different people, especially sort of practically minded people, have got different specialized knowledge about different things. And we both understand this and are ready to be corrected by them about it, especially if the correction is pertinent. I mean, it would be a bit like if you were somewhere where there was a medical emergency and you were asked to go and help out in an operating theater. And the surgeon who is operating might say, give me a something or other. And you wouldn't have the faintest idea what it is. And it would have to be pointed out to you, and you'd have to be told what this particular thing is called. And this seems, in a certain sense, a ubiquitous feature of our use of language, but this indicates that at a certain level, there's always going to be possibilities of error. And this, I'd have thought, is very much our common experience. It would seem, however, as near as you like to being certain once one has got this description. This might seem a real advantage. For example, if you wanted to be able to confirm or refute something for sure, obviously only on the basis of that particular observation. If it was a general claim, then it wouldn't help you all that much. And also, if you want to reason probabilistically, there seem to be huge advantages to being able to do so on the basis of certainty. Although there is the difficulty that what we seem to need is not the experience, but a statement about it, which might introduce a range of difficulties which come when we try to describe individual subjective experience in the terminology of a publicly shared language. I mean, it always seems to me in a way quite baffling that we can make any sense at all of poetry if people are setting out to describe their own innermost experiences. I mean, just how much commonality is there about that? There is, however, it is here, however, that we hit three further problems. First, and this also applies to claims about sense data, there is the difficulty that our theories about the world don't ordinarily make claims about our subjective experiences. That's to say, typically our theories are theories about objects in the world and their properties and behavior. If we were to derive from them statements about a particular individual's subjective experience, we would normally have to add, say, to our physical or chemical theories or to our common sense ideas, all sorts of theoretical knowledge which we don't normally have to have available to us, which we don't normally have to hand, about how those things and their behavior is supposed to relate to our subjective experience. One would need not just physics, but say physics and a branch of psychology. A second problem was the one that I mentioned earlier, namely that our experiences are typically influenced by or are couched in terms of our theories. How we experience anything typically makes reference to our theories about it. The problem about the seeming table approach is that with regard to anything that's influenced by our theories, and here when I'm talking about reference to our theories, I'm talking about how we are describing what it is that we're experiencing. The theories in terms of which our observations are couched, which may well be false, get preserved in this subjectivized version of seeming something along with our observations. For example, suppose that someone in the 17th century took themselves to be observing a witch. We get, following this approach, a subjectivized version of their theoretically latent observation statement. We might indeed grant to them, with the content of this being preserved, a bit like a fly might be in jade, the theoretical content in a subjectivized form is preserved. We have this knowledge for certain, but the difficulty is what use is that to us? There is then the problem of how we should relate any of these statements to a theory which we wish to test. Not only, as I've mentioned, does our theory not make statements about such things, but it's not altogether clear what we can derive from our observation statement. That's to say, we presumably know something about how witches would behave if they existed. I remember in this context hearing many years ago Paul Feyerabend lecturing and giving us a great deal of information about the behavior of witches, which he gleaned from reading a kind of witch hunting book called Malleus Maleficarum. And he passed on such important information as that the sexual member of the devil was apparently icy cold. Okay, so if witches existed, if they engaged in sexual congress with the devil, one would imagine that one would expect to hear various sharp noises from the witches. But it's not clear with what a statement about a seeming witch is compatible or incompatible. That's to say, while the statement about the seeming witch might be certain, I'm seeing a seeming witch, with what is it compatible or incompatible? Lewis Carroll, the author of the Alice books, famously wrote in his A Strange Wild Song, he thought he saw a banker's clerk. That's to say, before banks were automated, the sort of person who worked behind a bank counter. Descending from the bus, he looked again and found it was a hippopotamus. If this should stay to dine, he said, there won't be much for us. Here, just to remind you, is a hippopotamus. Suppose that Carroll had subjectivized the claims that were made in this little poem of his. He would then get certainty in respect of both the banker's clerk and the hippo. But in subjectivized versions of them. However, the problem here is that while a hippo would pose a threat to his dinner, it's not clear what consequences one could draw about the behavior of a seeming hippo. I mean, is a seeming hippo going to eat your dinner or not? And indeed, if he ends up within succession a seeming banker's clerk and then a seeming hippo, he may be kind of puzzled, but even though it would be perfectly true that he's certain about both of these claims, this wouldn't be much of a consolation to him. Now, Popper, it seems to me, takes a resolutely alternative view of these matters from these sorts of approaches which emphasize the subjective. On his account, our observation statements should be about what we observe, where this is to be understood as an object in the world and how it's behaving, rather than about our experience of something, unless we happen, as in some areas of psychology, to be interested in features of our experience as such. For example, if we're interested in the psychology of illusions, then we may be interested in getting people to report on what they are experiencing. But that contrasts with what we're normally interested in. On Popper's account, we may be motivated to make a particular statement because of what we experience. But the experience as such, Popper wants to argue, has no epistemological role. Rather, what's important is that we make an observation and then issue a statement about what was observed, where the tentative epistemological value of the statement depends really on its intersubjective acceptability, particularly as to whether it clashes with other reports, whether it clashes with other theories, or if people repeat the test, what statements they then come up with in terms of what they were observing. What this means is that, as I'd understand it, from Popper's approach, you undertake an observation either in ordinary life or in the course of, say, conducting a chemical test or a physical experiment. And then you report on what you see, what you saw as being there in the world, not on what your subjective experience was. You also need to give an account of the procedure which you adopted in case someone else is interested in checking your observation for themselves. But clearly, if you report on your subjective experience, for example, that at 7:30 p.m. in my office in Dumfries, I had a vivid experience of seeing a cat, there's no way in which anyone else can check this or in which I would be able to revisit it myself if I'm just reporting on the subjective experience. It's worth here briefly referring again to Popper's ideas about objectivity. They seem to me to be particularly important, and in his emphasis on intersubjectivity, to be one of the themes that Kant drew from his reading and thinking about the work of Immanuel Kant. There's interesting resemblance here, it seems to me, in fact, from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky's ideas in his Thought and Language, and to what some people, such as, for example, Rom Harre, have made of Wittgenstein's private language argument. The key idea here, which I think is neatly set out in Popper's Open Society, chapter 23, is that Popper sees objectivity as a product of intersubjective criticism. That's to say, for him, our ideas are fallible, but the key way in which we learn what's wrong with them is by exposing them to criticism by others when those people are concerned with discovering the truth or the validity or the falsity or the invalidity of those ideas. Really, we may learn from other people what sort of check they put our ideas through, and then may come to internalize certain standards. In addition, particular ways of doing things may come to be accepted as good as it were standard procedures, which, unless anyone comes forth with a good argument as to why they're problematic, we typically take as a reliable way of testing things. But the key, it seems to me, from Popper's perspective, is intersubjective scrutiny. And I would conclude from this tentative intersubjective acceptability. It's against this that we test our various claims. There are various aspects to this. First, I should stress the fact that something's being intersubjectively accepted obviously doesn't make it true, and we may simply be mistaken about something. Although other things being equal, we might tentatively accept something where there is this kind of intersubjective agreement as being correct. But this makes it extremely important to see whether, in fact, there is such intersubjective agreement about something, particularly in terms of observation statements. Second, we initially discover that a statement about what we observe may be problematic if it was not what we or others expected. This might prompt us, if we're on our own, to look again to see if there were perhaps any odd factors involved which we hadn't taken account of, and also if different senses could be involved, sight, touch, taste, to check what we observed using one against the others. I recall in this context doing a practical exam in chemistry at a fairly low level in a laboratory. I was told to heat a particular substance, and I was convinced, because it appeared to be an organic substance, that the gas that it was giving off in large quantities must be carbon dioxide. But I kept bubbling it through lime water, and the lime water didn't go cloudy. And so I was just starting to get baffled as to what was going on. And then I heard in the distance a popping sound. And I realized that someone else must have placed the gas that was coming out of their test tube close to their Bunsen burner. It had ignited with a pop, and that indicated that it was hydrogen. And so I wrote down, no one told me this, but I wrote down that that is what must have been given off. It was only afterwards that I did a bit of investigating and discovered that there is an organic substance which, if heated, gives off hydrogen. I hadn't come across this before, but it was this sort of indirect check by what someone else is doing that gave me the clue. We would, I think, typically also ask other people to check the observation, and also to check in libraries, on the internet, and so on, to see if there were other similar reports. That's to say, in cases where the result which we were getting was unexpected. Note, however, that we're concerned here with intersubjective acceptability as a candidate for truth. That's to say, we're concerned really with dialogue and tentative acceptance and making use of tests which have been intersubjectively, tentatively accepted as good ways to go. But where what matters is what we are aiming at, namely that we actually have issued a true description of what exists, of what is going on. We're not dealing here just with a convention or agreement as such. It's an agreement, as it were, that this seems to be correct, not an agreement that, you know, it seems a good idea to drive on the right-hand side of the road, where one equally accepts that it would be perfectly good if everyone was driving on the left. If you say, well, what of experience? The obvious responses seem to me to be as follows. First, we don't actually know what one another's experiences, taken as psychological experiences, are like. Our experiences may be vivid, but we can typically only describe them in terms drawn from our knowledge of the behavior of objects in the world. Second, I think there is good reason to suppose that how we experience the world is different. I regularly learn from my wife when she complains about me that I don't see things that he does, or if I do see them, I don't see them in the way that she does. I also like cats very much. He puts up with our cat. And I suspect that my experience of the cat, my awareness of the cat, my feel for nuances in the cat's behavior, and so on, probably mean that my psychological experiences of things to do with certainly our cat are very different to hers. And so I think that if one really is wanting to insist that what we're dealing with here has to be our psychological experiences as such, then one may get into something that gets a bit complicated. What we experience, and this probably comes in with regard to my interest in our cat, seems to relate to our tastes and interests, our expectations, and our theories. In addition, if different people initially report that they are seeing different things, they typically then come to revise their statements in the light of discussion, looking again, and so on. And I'm sure you must have been through what for me is quite a common experience of being with someone else, reporting that you see someone, they saying, no, I don't think it's that. And where there's a fair bit of going back and forth between you until you reach tentative agreement on what it is that you're seeing. We also learn from other people that some of our experiences in dreams, in visions, in hallucinations don't represent what things are actually like. I would also say, although I have no idea what was going on at all, that I had this experience on which I reported to you of having seen the moon turn completely round on itself. This was as vivid as pretty much any other experience that I can remember. It clearly wasn't veridical. I have no idea what was going on, but I know from talking to other people, I know from reading up a bit about physics and so on, that it couldn't have been what was actually happening. I was for sure having this experience. And it seems to me that we may have very vivid experiences which don't actually represent what things are like. I'm actually reminded in this context that my mother, in her mid 70s, alas, came down with Alzheimer's disease. And one of the features of that, which I found quite interesting, was that she would have dreams which she then had difficulty sorting out weren't veridical. And this wasn't anything to do with how vivid they were. It's just that the sort of procedure that the rest of us normally go through in terms of matching up what we are experiencing with our other knowledge and experiences, with other people's knowledge and so on, was something which had started to break down in her case. But I've no doubt that the experiences were extremely vivid and the kind of thing which, if we had those experiences in the normal course of events, we would take to be completely veridical. Well, it seems to me that we place the credence that we do in statements that we and others make about what we experience because of our ability to fit these things into discourse that we share with others and into our shared tentative knowledge about the world. This doesn't mean that these things are true for certain. It does mean, I think, that it's perfectly reasonable for us to accept them tentatively as reports on what we had seen. And also because statements that we make in certain settings turn out typically to pass tests, and also further, because in some cases we might even be able to offer an explanation as to how it was that we saw what we did. From that point of view, it seems to me, knowledge that someone who is a specialist in human physiology and psychology and so on may be able to give us about what was going on would be quite interesting. But epistemologically, we don't have access in any direct way to the kind of things that are being invoked here. And so I don't think myself that looking for a causal theory of basic statements is necessarily very helpful. What does all this mean? Clearly, what we want is that the observation statement that we're dealing with should be true. But we have no surefire method of telling whether or not it is. And what Popper has said about the irrelevance, of our subjective certainty to the issue of truth is highly relevant in this context. Popper's approach was that we should undertake a test, issue a statement about what we saw, or if it's appropriate, about what we felt, and so on, and then see if it is intersubjectively acceptable. We will typically first go through various cross-checks ourselves, which one might see as anticipating the kinds of scrutiny that others would have put us through had they been there and been able to either make an observation at the same time as we did, or been able to follow us in making the observation using the information about the procedure which we'd given them. But also, as I've suggested, we need to check the coherence of this with other kinds of knowledge. And I think Popper's on the sources of knowledge and of ignorance in his Conjectures and Refutations is well worth rereading or reading in this context. A couple of points about all this. First, what it means is that our test statements are typically singular existential statements. For example, there is a glass sitting on a book on my desk, which I'm just picking up. They attribute dispositional properties to things which go beyond anything that might be argued to be given to our senses. And I picked this up. I took it to be a glass of water. I would say, if anyone asked me, well, I saw a glass of water on my desk, which was about half full. But describing it as water clearly is attributing to it properties that go beyond what I'm in any sense directly experiencing now. I mean, clearly, if I picked up the glass, half glass of water, drank it, sat down, went to carry on the lecture, but in fact collapsed instead, you might well have said, aha, someone who doesn't like Jeremy, or possibly someone who doesn't like Popper, or even possibly someone who does like Popper but doesn't like travesties of his views, had come in and slipped something poisonous into the glass. These things are also restricted in their scope so as to relate to things that are taken to be observable. Popper himself refers, when giving examples, to these things, say, as being statements about observable objects. For example, to things like what is indicated on the dial of some piece of apparatus. But in principle, they could be extended if, say, we're testing certain psychological theories to reports about what there was to be experienced. Say, if I was making a report about whether or not I saw something as exhibiting the Müller-Lyer illusion. Popper's discussion in this context of the approach of the so-called Würzburg school in psychology in The Self and Its Brain is quite interesting. These reports would then be accompanied by a kind of recipe telling other people how to replicate these if they wished to test them. Second, all this has, to the traditional empiricist, the somewhat alarming feature that while experience may motivate us to make a test statement, it can't, on Popper's account, justify it. However, this seems to me personally to be reasonable enough. For we may well observe something, and the statement that we make about it could turn out to be false. This we'll typically discover from others, or perhaps we may discover it for ourselves, especially if we go and check. That we had a particular kind of experience, however, seems to be neither here nor there with regard to the truth of the statement. Although if it was false, we might well explain why we had a particular kind of experience. If it's true, this may well explain why we had a particular kind of experience. Well, if it's false, we may well be interested if it can be done to explain why our experience wasn't veridical. And if someone can explain to me why I should have seen the moon turn completely round on itself, I mean, I'm not kind of dying to know about this, but if there is a simple explanation, I'd be most interested. If we can't, it isn't a big deal. People quite often see rather strange things or misperceived things. Indeed, in this context, it's sometimes been argued that people, for example, who suffer from certain of the things that are covered by the label of schizophrenia and hear voices when there's no one around, maybe having experiences that a lot of us have just on occasion. But the difference essentially is in our ability to be able to make judgments as to whether or not our experience in this context is veridical. It seems to me personally that the resulting view is a perfectly reasonable one, if slightly unusual. That's to say that what matter are the statements that we make in particular situations and their acceptability both to others when they are in the appropriate social situation. Here meaning, for example, that they are also looking at the apparatus and that they have got their eyes open. And also that these things are acceptable to ourselves if we run cross-check. These things on this account would matter rather than what the psychological experiences are that we're having. Clearly, we're all likely to have experiences, but what these are may differ from person to person. Compare only the reactions of different people to the same situation, say, if they go into a room. At any rate, this is the distinctive theory that Popper offered of the empirical basis. If you look, for example, at the Jarvie, Miller, and so on edited collection, Karl Popper 2000, you'll see a defense that I offered of it against some criticisms. You'll also see that most people still disagree with how I'm interpreting it, as does the author of the piece about basic statements in the Cambridge Companion to Popper. In some sense, people, even those who take themselves to be critical rationalists, at this point, it seems to me, just don't seem to be able to ditch their empiricist prejudices. But then, just because I don't seem to be able to get other people to accept or even to take seriously my account, perhaps I should be led to question it further. Let me call a halt with this. We can talk about some other things if you like, but you may have questions and objections, and let us move over to that. Any concerns? Can you stick your hand up either electronically or literally if you want to object or to ask me questions? Carlos.
Yes, I wonder why you don't refer to Quine thesis about observation sentences, for example, as another view to analyze this problem, because Quine have, I would say, a similar approach to Popper in this respect.
Well, I don't have I mean, I guess what I'd say is I don't have a particular burning interest in Quine if he has views which are at odds with those of Popper's. That's something which in this context I might have a look at. If you're telling me, well, he says things that are not that dissimilar to Popper's, I'd say, well, that's fine. I suspect that some other people might. The question is, can one get anything out of his approach which renders the kind of account that I've been offering here as problematic?
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, if you haven't anything at the moment, can I just ask you about one other thing? In Britain, one of the oddities of the country, amongst many others, which struck me when I came back here after being in Australia for about 25 years, is that first thing in the morning and then last thing in the evening, the radio station, Radio 4, spends about 10 or 12 minutes giving reports on the weather for sailors all around the British Isles. A reason for this is that weather tends to change here quite rapidly, and you can quite often get gales and things which will blow boats out of the sea or whatever. Now, one of the interesting things that struck me when listening to this is that they give some reports from so-called coastal stations. And the bulk of these now are automated. And essentially what they're doing is saying, well, the pressure is so-and-so and it is rising, or visibility is so-and-so, but it's getting better, and various things of this kind. And this is being reported by mechanized means. And my question to you is, do these things count as observation statements? Is there any reason why we shouldn't treat them pretty much in the same way as we would if instead of the apparatus on one occasion, perhaps it had broken, someone in a sailor's hat or something was looking at the things and was reading these things out to us on the basis of what he was seeing? I don't see why we shouldn't put them pretty much on a par, although clearly we may then say, well, this doesn't seem to be fitting in with the reports we're getting from elsewhere, or it doesn't seem to fit at all what we are expecting to be happening there, given what our theory is about how this particular depression is moving. So does it actually matter that there was no subjective experience involved at that point? Tanya.
I'm using someone else's computer. It's still John.
Okay, John. Sorry, I have a bad visual memory, and
I'm using someone else's computer.
I mean, and these days one mustn't make kind of personal comments.
I'm not transitioning. I'm not transitioning.
No, but look, this is up to you.
Gender.
Okay, carry on.
Okay, no, I would say to answer that question directly, no. I mean, if the barometer is giving a reading, then I would say that's a pretty accurate, if not more accurate, indication of what's going on weather-wise at that particular point than what a person who's observing it.
I mean, in both cases, it might be wrong.
Well, I mean, if the barometer is broken.
Yeah, but I mean, you can never really tell what's going on in such cases. I mean, just like an observation report from someone there. I mean, he may just have misreported it.
Sure. No, but I mean, I would say that the measuring device that is giving information about the air pressure, I mean, I'm not a meteorologist, but to the extent that changes in air pressure are significant indications of changes in the weather, then yeah, sure, the barometer measurement is quite the same. I mean, is your question whether, you know,
well,
a subjective...
my question is, we typically take the view that it is human observation statements that play a key role in confirming or disconfirming theories. And I'm asking here, well, in such cases, does it actually matter if there was human experience involved?
Yes, I would say.
Okay.
Because I mean, take for example, people's different perception of color, for example, yeah? The distribution of the rods and cones in my retina is going to be different than yours. And so I'm going to perceive different shades of color differently. But if I take let's say a light meter, that's going to be able to express it in numerical form, which is going to be more, shall we say, objective and accurate, no?
Well, yes, although clearly any apparatus may be problematic. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is what role, or is it important that human experience plays a particular role in all this? I've got a couple of other questions. I've had Margareta and then Thomas. Can I take Margareta and then we can we can come back to you?
I'd like to come back to the witch example, perhaps.
Yes, okay. Well, look, I'll come round to you.
Sure. Go tell someone else and come back when you feel like it.
Right.
So I like Thomas can go before me.
You'd like Thomas to go before you? Okay.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Why not? I don't know about British radio broadcasting, but in the way as you described it, well, I think one can even understand it as a case of a Turing test situation. If there is just a radio statement read or heard by somebody who is listening to the radio, well, how do you know if it was a report by a human weather observer or whether it's the report by, well, an automatic system? I mean, and the difference that you, I think that you have pointed out is that there could be the case of observational statements without subjective experience. In the cases that an automatic system measured, I don't know, temperature and air pressure and stuff like that. And I would say there is no difference in an observation statement by a machine and a human. But I would like to know more in which cases you use them. In the case of just broadcasting it through the radio, no, there is no difference. But in the case of justification, why did somebody see it, or why was it measured? In the case of doubt, if, I don't know, all weather stations report sun and one weather station reports rain or something like that, then I think the experience plays a role. So when there is a conflict, then there is more needed from the observation statements. And then, of course, there is a difference.
Okay, but you see, I think the key issue is really this, and it is brought out quite nicely by Popper's article, which is in Conjectures and Refutations, on the sources of knowledge and of ignorance. Because let's put it this way. You have a radio announcer who is reading out information. He is getting information from various sources. So typically, I think these days, these reports from weather stations are going to be transmitted to the studio or to somewhere or other else automatically. They then appear as stuff on his computer, which he reads out. If he is, or if someone, probably before you get to the announcer, is dubious about something, how should they proceed? Well, I take it that Popper's approach is really to say, if you're skeptical about it, for example, if it doesn't seem to cohere with your other knowledge, you need to check it again. You need to test it. You're not actually fearfully interested in what the experience was of the person who reported on it. I mean, suppose that it's the case that all the other things are working automatically, one of them is broken, and that this was spotted, and an engineer who was about to repair it said, I'm going to have to actually type in the report myself because the machine can't generate it. Now, it seems to me that what is pertinent is that you're getting a report which is being made in certain appropriate circumstances, aiming at telling the truth about that, but that if you're dubious about it, what you want to do is to be able to test it, not to ask questions about the psychological background to the making of it, as it were. I mean, let me give you another kind of example. Imagine there is someone who is reporting on observation, on the state of an instrument, really very, very regularly. My suspicion is that if it is something that the person does very regularly, they may actually themselves get to the point where they can just automatically generate reports about it, and it's not clear what observational information they actually have. I mean, there are all kinds of things that people can do if they're relatively familiar with operations where they don't have to think about them. And I'm happy to be corrected if someone actually knows about the psychology of this, but where if one actually were to ask what was the person experiencing at that point, of which in fact he generated a veridical report, it might well have been, well, he was imagining his girlfriend, or he was thinking about the glass of beer and he may have a strong visual imagination. And so this may have just happened simply as a result of a habituated process. So I guess the reason that I'm saying these things is because we seem to have a very strong kind of preoccupation with the idea that all of our knowledge should be based on experience, where that is interpreted in terms of what psychologically was going through our consciousness at the time. And I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think that various strands in what Popper is suggesting pushes a bit away from that. I referred to Wittgenstein's private language argument, and I think the difference is Popper certainly isn't denying that people have conscious experiences. And there may be all kinds of issues that people have in terms of how to match up the kind of conscious experiences that they have with things that other people can make any sense of. So, you know, a young man who finds himself in difficulties in his teens may it may suddenly dawn on him, I mean, perhaps I'm gay, or it may be the case that someone else comes across, perhaps even reasonably late in life, a description of Asperger's syndrome, and then says, yes, I mean, this actually, in a certain sense, explains what's going on and what the character of my experience is. It may also be the case that you're just kind of hopeless at a lot of practical things. I mean, I often think that if I hadn't managed to make a living doing what I did, I'm just not sure quite what else I would have been able to make a living at, because I'm just hopeless at sort of routine office-style tasks. Any more for now, Thomas, or should I move to Margareta? And
no, I'm happy.
Okay.
I mean, you do not need the subjective experience in order to justify an observational statement.
Okay, although justify may be a problem, but still, I mean, we can talk about that subsequently if you like. Margareta, are you going to have a go at me?
Yes, but it's not really a go, I guess. This my first reaction was going to be like, I need to sleep over your presentation to really think.
Well, see, normally the reaction is that the presentation sends people to sleep. So
no, I wanted to dream about it first. But then when you brought up the example of the automated report, I started thinking about this comment I had in the back of my mind, and I wasn't really clear how you were addressing it, and that's the reason I want to listen to the presentation another time and look at the slides. And that is, the observation reports need to be in a language, and the language that needed to be developed, and so there is something missing here, and that is like the undergrowth or the undercurrent. And that is that we all need to learn to read and write. And this gets back to Popper's arguments about the distinction between the third and the fourth function of language. And I'm just still thinking it through. But then you made a comment about the machine, and then I thought, wow, now I can say something. So I think that that Popper is trying to warn us against this machine-like thinking, where we say we either do the computations or we observe. And that for him, it's really about the discursive processes. Like you said, we go for ourselves and check out whether the observations of the machine are correct. So that is what we need to do. We shouldn't start arguing with the robot whether he has correct observations. No, we go and test for ourselves. So,
well, okay, but what I would say about it is we surely would typically only initiate that if we thought that there was something peculiar about what, for example, the automated weather station was telling us. I mean,
yeah,
just exactly similarly to the way in which if you got a lab report from someone and it seemed really kind of very strange, we would go and ask another question about it in the light of it's not cohering with our other ideas. Now, this doesn't mean that you're disallowing observations because they don't fit particular theories. It's just that if they are in conflict with another theory, then what you might then want to do is to go and alert the person or someone else to the fact that there is this discrepancy and say, in the light of that, look, if this observation report is correct, then it's actually very significant, but it isn't something that we were expecting. So could we go and check it out again? Or is there another way in which we could examine these things, just because this is unusual and it would be really important if it was right?
all right.
Okay, well, look, I'll let you dream on now. John, do you want to come back at us? Witches, you're muted. John, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Before I get to the witches, I think one thing that's very important in this context are two aspects of Popper. One is his idea of methodological nominalism in science. That is to say, not to be caught up with the meanings of words, but rather about the fact of the what is actually true. Second is his anti-psychologism. So he is against Hume's what he called Hume's subjective or epistemology, that is the basing, taking the idea of induction too far. And the other thing is that the theory-laden nature of observation. So if we were to use this for your witches example, we have people observing, let's say, attractive red-haired women that monks are aroused by. That's one observation. But you've got this concept, you've got this idea of there being witches, which of course conditions what they observe. Yeah, in other words, they have a theory that there's a thing called a witch. Yeah, I mean, even any universal, right? The idea that a universal a concept refers to something is itself a theory. Yeah, I mean, every form of observation has a theory behind it. Yeah, and obviously the medieval theory was wrong.
Okay, but my point in raising that was to say, if in the quest for certainty or to capture what one's experience is, you reacted to that example by saying, well, I am for sure seeing a seeming witch. Problem is, that is true enough, but the difficulty about it is that you're still left, exactly as you indicated, John, with the false theory embedded in this description of what the thing seems to be.
Yeah.
Now, you might say, well, isn't all of this stuff obvious? Surely the kind of approach that I'm offering here must be accepted by everyone. Well, I don't think it is. I have been very struck by the way in which people who are broadly in agreement with Popper seem, I think, to want to get back to bringing in experience in some form or other. And John Watkins' book does this. Elie Zaha has written along these lines. And also there is the piece about observation statements in the Cambridge Companion to Popper, which again, for my money, wants to take us back towards the psychological experiences as such as playing a vital role.
It seems anathema to Popper to me.
Well, what I would say is, well, these people typically read Popper's account, say that it isn't any good, and I think then go back to odd ghosts of the empiricist tradition. And so what I'm going to come to you in a second, Carl. All I wanted to say was, I think myself that there's something to be said for exploring the kind of view that I've tried to offer you as being in Popper's work, but I might have got it wrong, or it may be the case that these other accounts are right and I am not. Now, Carlos, you need to unmute.
No, I just going to point out that many of those critics of Popper, including some people close to Popper philosophy, like John Watkins, that I have the privilege to study under him, is that there is still some sort of justificationist. I mean, what people are rejecting is the idea that in Popper, justification have no role. So you don't justify the truth or falsity of your basic statement appealing to experience. That is I see the cut that Popper made between accepting the true or falsity of a statement and the justification for doing that. So for Popper, no experience justifies the truth of a basic statement or observation statement. And this is very difficult to swallow for many people. And I think that's a problem.
I think that's right, but I think what one then has to do is to spell out what the process of being able to agree on statements about states of affairs, which you can then use to criticize our theories, should then be. And I recall suggesting at one point that it isn't a theory of truth, but as a theory of knowledge, that the approach that I'd see as coming out of Popper leads to a particular kind of concern for coherence with our other knowledge, although one which is fallibilist and is directed towards truth. And then it's a matter of explicating what that amounts to. Popper's own comments about all of this stuff in The Logic of Scientific Discovery are really, I think they're very interesting, but they're also really very brief. And it seems to me a great shame that he didn't later talk or write much more expansively about these things. But given that he didn't, and given that all along there have been a range of criticisms of his ideas on this, from Otto Neurath's original critical review of The Logic of Scientific Discovery, through to papers by other people who in other respects would see their approach as being Popperian, that it seems to me to be a field in which if someone is interested in this stuff, they could then very usefully have a look at this and write a better interpretation than has been offered and a defense of it.
Can I just add something else? Okay, yes, okay, but then it seemed to me that all this type of discussion, I don't know how we can argue about this issue without taking in consideration the role of psychology, cognitive psychology, and scientific psychology here, you see. Because when we are dealing with all these issues, including Popper distinction, he seemed to me he was not using all the scientific psychological knowledge when he was discussing this, okay? Except probably gestalt psychology or whatever. So it seems to me that today we have to have a kind of, sorry, besides Popperian, I am a little bit of Quinian or Quinian. Probably now we have to have a sort of naturalized epistemology, okay, where all these issues are not philosophically, is not epistemology, philosophical epistemology, but it has to be a sort of philosophy and science together. Without this combination, it's very difficult to settle all these issues.
Well, perhaps, but I did offer you, with regard to the weather station example, an argument for the irrelevance of psychology to the theory of basic statements. And if that's right, I'm not sure that psychology would, I mean, psychology is very interesting, but I'm not sure that it would be of the slightest help here. And this is why and I think you put your finger on something quite important. This is why I would take what I was saying to be in certain respects quite provocative. It's also one of the reasons why I'm not so happy about your efforts to bring Quine and Popper together, because that seems to me much more of a Quinean enterprise. But at any rate, that's my quick response on that. But I think that you should come back on it either now or subsequently. I've got next Philip wants to come in.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I suggest two things? First of all, there is, because of the development in Popper's theory, I think there is a certain redundancy when we are speaking of subjectivity of an observer. He made use of that in his earlier work, but I wonder whether it is needed after we have a clear distinction between worlds 3 and world 2. It seems to me that in Popper's later work, what you have is an autonomy of world 3, sorry, autonomy of world 2 that is entirely dependent on the existence of world 3. Without world 3 existing, without there being objective theories to refer to, objective ideas to discuss, what you have otherwise in world 2 could be very directly reducible to world 1. What makes world 2 irreducible is the existence, simultaneous or prior existence perhaps, of world 3, of objective ideas. Regarding the question that you posed earlier about observations from a machine as opposed to observations from a human being, I think human beings can, human observers can in the simple observation sense be largely reduced to mechanics, to the ability of an eye to perceive or an ear to hear or something of that nature. What it is dependent upon, however, is a very substantial engagement with theories from world 3, and that those world 3 theories would have informed the design of any mechanical observation. They would have been, so to speak, already carved into that, but human beings can develop their understanding of world 3, can develop their the qualities, if you will, that go into their observations, and make that's what, you know. So let me stop on that.
Okay, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just wonder whether it leads to any qualifications to or corrections to the sort of account that I was trying to offer, because at one level, it's very important to be able to offer an account of what it is against which theoretical claims are to be assessed. And I would take it that the crucial thing that I was suggesting in this was that what I think is a natural way of reading Popper's approach is to say, look, in this, we should go back to really the issuing of claims, and clearly in the case both of ourselves and in different ways of machines, there has to be a lot of work in the background to enable us as organisms in certain circumstances to be able to issue particular kinds of claims if we're making an observation. But the big question in all of this is just what role in this do our psychological experiences play? So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think we've still got this quite interesting question that a lot of people, indeed, including people who in some ways are sympathetic towards Popper, don't want to get rid of this element of the empiricist tradition. But then I'd be tempted to say, well, if you do get rid of it, then one has to explicate a theory about how all of this stuff is supposed to work.
I think you can, Jeremy. You can largely sidestep most of the references to psychology if you see what has been taken as psychology as very largely reactions by the individual to debates about objective knowledge, debates about theories that are in play and are developed by others and criticized by others. That I think that's the intersubjective element that Popper was referring to earlier.
But what we need in all of this is an account of what empirical criticism consists of. And it's just that the empiricist tradition tended to say it is stuff that goes back to reports on our psychological experiences. Whereas I think that this is where I'm very much open to correction, that Popper's move on this is to push us much more towards saying what we have to do is to see what people, if they are trying to generate a true report on when they are seeing something, which is a somewhat different matter. And then there's this question of, well, how do we set up, or can we set up machines together with ways of interpreting how they're behaving to do the same sort of thing, to be engaged with us. And I think that we can, but in the case of the machine, you see the element of psychological experience of that particular thing then, which the empiricist tradition is typically stressing, seems really to disappear. Okay, I've got Carlos. Can I just check if Margareta was wanting to get in before, because I got something saying trick question from Margareta, and then Carlos.
Yes, and I'm glad because I'm now also responding to Carlos and a little bit to Philip. But first, I think, Jeremy, that you were asking us a trick question, and so I think I actually agree with you. But I need to listen again to your lecture. The trick question is that people start talking about the machine and whether it's a Turing test, but it's actually about how we are responding to the observation reports. And that gets back to that I think that Popper it's really a discursive philosophy. So it's not descriptive or prescriptive. And that's the problem, I think, with the empirical base people. So they think, oh, we only have two choices. It's either descriptive or prescriptive. But the reality, and this is a response to Carlos, you cannot do naturalized epistemology because there is a huge disagreement in psychology on whether you need to model the mind as a machine, dus a computer, literally, or whether it's Gestalt psychology. And the Gestalt psychology, that's the tradition in which Popper is working. And that's a very different way of thinking than a computer. And there is a huge battle brewing, so to say, in psychology between European psychologists and American psychologists, because the Europeans are the one that are really pushing the Gestalt approach more, and the Americans think that the problem has been solved. So we're thinking like computers, so there is nothing really to be learned anymore. Well, in reality, there is. And so, Jeremy, so I'm giving it back to you, but I think just what is missing that you didn't emphasize is just the trial and error involves reading and writing. And so this the baby comes out of the womb and it needs to learn the language, and it keeps on learning and trying, and then it grows up and it knows how to read and write and talk and listen. And that is the discursive element that I think is really inside Popper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, I don't disagree, although what I would say is that you might say that what the automated weather stations are doing is issuing things which we are taking as being descriptions, but it's then a matter of our handling these things in a discursive way. I mean, there's another parallel to that, because if you consider, say, the von Frisch's work, and then other people subsequently, on the language of the bees. And there is this notion that you have this dance of the bees in which bees communicate to other bees the direction and distance away of good sources of nectar. Okay. Now, what I don't know is, in the case of a bee colony, is what you do if a bee gives you wrong information. I mean, I mean, it may be the sort of thing that no one's ever bothered with. It may be well known. It might be something which people are dying to try out, but which they can't get past the ethics committees of their university on the grounds that it would be likely, possibly, to lead to severe damage to the bee who is getting things wrong. But one might there find that actually, if a bee was persistently giving the other bees wrong directions, you could imagine either they just start to ignore it, or you could imagine that they actually kill it. I don't know, but certainly while there is the dance of the bees, which communicates is understood as communicating descriptive material, you don't seem to have the argumentative function or the social procedures which you were talking about, through which we go through and which we then feed into our automated weather station into, just on the grounds that at some point people in the meteorology office or something, when they get this stuff in, if a particular weather station just seems to be completely out of whack, they will put a big question mark by it and then may want to make investigations into it. But it's that kind of ability which we bring in with regard to putative basic statements, which, as far as I know, what I don't know is whether any other animals have got this. I mean, I don't know, for example, when Washoe was taught American Sign Language, whether Washoe was able to handle falsity and how did it react And if there was a group of chimpanzees who learned American Sign Language or bonobo or whatever, how would they start behaving if someone was signing persistently wrong? But still, that's enough of this. Anyone else at all? No further. Oh, Carlos. Okay.
Yes, sorry to be repetitive, but again, I think that Popper epistemology is characterized by abandoning justification. Okay, so many people are asking Popper to be a traditional empiricist or rationalist, and he say he's not a traditional empiricist or rationalist philosopher because he doesn't believe in justification. So Popper epistemology seems to me is not justificationist. Okay, and then I want to say that when you are asking us about the use of some measurement instrument here, like temperature, okay, or whatever, it seems to me that, or better, I want to clarify, are you saying, or are you asking us, do you think you are justified in believing what the instrument is telling you? Because if that is your question, appropriate answer, according to me, but I can be wrong, is this is a justification-oriented question. Different to ask what is causing you to see the reading, and talking about the reading of the machine or whatever, to are you justified in believing what you are seeing in the measurement apparatus that you have in front of you?
Look, the short answer is it isn't about justification, but I think there is a real issue that has to be addressed, which is the following. Falsification or corroboration plays an important role in Popper's approach. What does one take as falsifying or corroborating? It's statements of certain kinds, but statements which have what as their subject matter, and statements which are generated in what circumstances, and what is the procedure through which these are tentatively accepted as things which could either call other theories into question or alternatively suggest to us that our theory has passed an important test. And so what we're dealing with here is not the issue of justification, but with the issue of the empirical basis and its character. Any other questions or objections for now? Well, in that case, and I guess to the benefit of those people who are participating from the United States, where it is the 4th of July and they have other things to do, like letting off fireworks, waving flags around, and generally behaving in a boisterous manner, I guess we should probably call a halt. I realized as I got towards the end of these slides that I actually gave you a slightly outdated version of the talk, and I will, in the notes, send you the somewhat more up-to-date one together with the references and so on. May I thank you all very much, and for Americans, or for those people who feel American in spirit, all the best for the 4th of July. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week. And next week,
Congratulations, Philip Benesh.
thank you.
Congratulations, Philip.
I think Margarita also lives in the States. So
Oh, I'm sorry.
Me too.
I don't know who are American.
Hi.
Well, you don't have to be American to live in the States.
No, I know.
Right.
I know.
But
Yeah.
all I was
We all started somewhere else.
all I
Yeah.
was going to say is that next time I'm going to be talking about issues to do with the theme of the limits of reason in particularly the early parts of Popper's philosophy. I've touched on that already in some of the introductory lectures, but I'm going to be having a look at how this relates to some of the themes in the open society, to issues in politics, and to ethics as well. And then there'll be later in this course a second lecture on a related theme, which will discuss Bartley and issues about fideism and comprehensively critical rationalism. But that will be coming later. Next time, it's going to be these other matters. Philip.
Jeremy, can I make a very quick suggestion? Is it possible for you to perhaps have a very short, maybe single reading or reading list, just of maybe a chapter or something that you think is critical for people to read in order to best understand the points of the lecture in advance? I think that some pre-reading might be, or even a handout. I mean,
Okay.
maybe something that summarizes.
I will. Well, I can certainly produce something as a kind of advanced blurb for what I'll be doing at the time that I send the link round, and that will be coming out early next week. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bye.
Enjoy yourself
Bye-bye.
between now and next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.